Good afternoon, everybody. It is Thursday at 3 o'clock Poetry Workshops with Right 253. Today, we're going to talk about Ecopoetics, and this is the second of our workshop series that we're doing with Tacoma Ocean Fest as a way of helping you to generate some work for their story contest, which is going to be as part of their program on September 13th. The poems are due June 1st, so if you're a Tacoma High School or middle school student, or you go to Chief Leshai, you can submit. All the information is at the Tacoma Ocean Fest website, which we'll have at the end of the slideshow. But what we're trying to do is just help you get some ideas going. And today we're going to talk about eco-poetics. All right, so let's get into it. What is eco-poetics? Eco-poetics, this is from the Poetry Foundation website. It's a type of poetics that rose out of a late 20th century awareness of ecology and environmental disaster. A multidisciplinary approach that includes thinking and writing on poetics, science, and theory. Ecopoetics is not quite nature poetry, right? So I think sometimes people think of nature poetry, you're kind of set up somewhere looking at nature. Nature is the subject of the poem. Ecopoetics tends to rely a little bit more on how the human interacts with nature, right? So, what are we doing to, with, and because of nature? So, to think about it in this way, right, it goes beyond nature poetry. Um, and thinking about human effects on the environment and how we interact with impact and are impacted by the environment. So if you think about Ocean Fest this year, the theme is "We Are the Ocean," and so the question really becomes like how are we land dwelling mammals the ocean, right? Uh, how do we interact with it? How do we affect it in certain ways? So let's pop into a couple of poems. I've got one by June Jordan and one by W.S. Merwin. And so when I'm going to put the poems up here on the slides, and you can find them online as well. And as we read the poems, I'm going to ask you to kind of look for a couple of things. What's the interaction between humanity and nature in the poem? What imagery stands out to you? And what point, if any, is the writer making in the poem? Okay, so these are just questions you can ask yourself as you're reading the poem and as you're thinking about the poem. So let's start with June Jordan. June Jordan's poem, Look at the Blackbird Fall. And I'll read it out loud. If you don't want to hear me read it, hit pause and read it out loud to yourself. But I think it's really important to read a poem out loud, to hear the rhythm, to sort of see what the line breaks are doing, to get a sense of the kind of the spoken nature of the work. Look at the Blackbird Fall by June Jordan. Look at the blackbird fall down into the lake. Split white speedboats full of white people loading the atmosphere with gasoline and noise. Now you can't drink the water of the lake. You must drive somewhere else to buy bottle of water to drink beside the lake that is 10 miles long. What I need is a change of season, a snowmobile or springtime tomb that takes me from birth to 55 in 6 seconds. What I need is to adjust to the tree without the blackbird that fell into the lake. So there's a few things going on here in the poem, right? It's it's a lyrical poem. It sets a mood and it sets a scene. It's kind of like looking at a painting, if you will. And so the scene that it's setting is that you've got this lake, you've got speedboats, and if you've ever been in a lake that's got speedboats, sometimes they throw off some pretty stinky exhaust, right? And so the poet, the speaker of the poem, sort of watching this scene unfold where there's a juxtaposition of the human world, the speedboats, the gasoline, bottled water, and the natural world, the lake, the blackbird, and the tree, you know. And you also have this moment where the poet is kind of like taking herself out of the poem or taking the speaker out of the poem, wishing for something else to happen. And this is something I kind of don't quite get myself. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this notion of the springtime tomb that takes me from birth to 55 in 6 seconds. I think that's such an interesting line, but I honestly am not quite sure what the poet is getting at. So send me some DMs with thoughts around that line. But the idea I think here is that the poet is recognizing that there's a consequence to the actions, right? That the speedboats are eventually, or in this case, instantaneously leading to this blackbird falling in this, into the lake, presumably in my reading of it, dying and falling into the lake. Um, I'd love to hear what you think about it. So DM us on Instagram and let us know, right.253, what your reading of this poem is. I think there's also, June Jordan was an African American woman, and I think there's also an element uh, of racial disparity happening here, a kind of the white speedboats full of white people. And that to me is also a very interesting line, and thinking about ecological disaster and environmental racism and how that plays into this particular poem is to me also very interesting, and just sort of how we as a species uh, pollute the natural world, right? We can't drink the water from the lake, but we can drink the water from the plastic bottles, right? So again, right.253 on Instagram, hit us up with some DMs. What do you think about this poem? And to go back to our questions, what's the interaction between humanity and nature? What are the images that stand out to you? And what point, if any, is the writer making in the poem? The second poem is one by W.S. Merwin. And what I'm going to do here is bounce over to this reading. This is Merwin um, reading the poem. And I put the link at the end of the slideshow too, but if you find it here, you can go to Vimeo, and the reading of the poem starts at like 7:50, give or take. But he has a lead in where he talks about where this poem comes from and why he wrote it when he did, which was in the early 1960s. And it's really interesting. So I didn't want to spend too much time with this slideshow talking about it, but you can go back and watch that, and just sort of how history repeats itself. And thinking about this poem as written in 1967, to me is very interesting. So here's Merwin reading his poem. So I'll start it, but then I'll click back over so you can see the text.
And the whale was having a comeback, and now it's threatened again for a coming extinction. Gray whale, now that we are sending you to the end, that great God, tell him that we who follow you invented forgiveness and forgive nothing. I write as though you could understand and I could say it. One must always pretend something among the dying. When you have left the seas nodding on their stalks, empty of you, tell him that we were made on another day. The bewilderment will diminish like an echo winding along your inner mountains, unheard by us, that find its way out, leaving behind it the future, dead and ours. When you will not see again the whale calves trying the light, consider what you will find in the Black Garden and its court. The sea cows, the great auks, the gorillas, the irreplaceable hosts ranged countless and foreordaining as stars our sacrifices. Join your word to theirs. Tell him that it is we who are important.
Okay, so this poem is, I think, very different from June Jordan's poem in a lot of ways, but there's a similar impulse about extinction and about death in this poem. And I should pause here for a moment just to say that not every eco poem is about death. So don't feel like you have to write a poem about extinction, right? There's a lot to celebrate about the ocean and about how we interact with the ocean. So don't feel compelled to write a real bummer of a poem. These are just the two that I chose because I know them pretty well, and I like both of them a lot. But this particular poem stands out to me, like I said, because it was written in the early 60s. And Merwin talks about how the gray whale was facing extinction, and then it sort of made a comeback, and then it was facing extinction again. And for me, what really stands out for this poem is the real human impulse to be on the top of the food chain. And there's a line here, if you know sort of your Bible, tell him that we were made on another day. I think refers to the 6 days of creation, and the animals were made on one day, and the humans were made on another day. And so, what separates human beings from the animal world? And I think that that's such a fascinating question that I think about a lot, and I always look for in poems, and I look for in other texts that I read. But I also think that this poem is kind of serves as a warning, right? It's like uh, these mention of the sea cows and the great ox and the gorillas, the irreplaceable hosts ranged countless and foreordaining as stars our sacrifices. What is it that humanity gives up from this planet, and what would the uh, the gray whale say to the creator when it arrives, at his or her feet, as it were, right? In this case, him. Tell him that we who follow you invented forgiveness and forgive nothing. Such a fascinating and biting line to sort of end that first stanza. Okay, so we've got two poems here, both of them dealing with the sort of darker consequences of human beings' interactions with nature. Like I said, not all of your eco poems have to do this. But what are some prompts? What can get you writing about this, thinking about the interaction of humans and nature? Oh, here's another typo. You got to forgive me for all the typos. I kind of like belted this out, and I should have proofread, and I'm really bad proofreader in this case. But we're thinking about the theme for the Tacoma Ocean Fest this year. We Are Ocean. Write a poem in which the human and the ocean interact in positive or negative ways, right? So if you have firsthand experience of being in the ocean or being at the ocean, write about that. If you have a firsthand experience of being around sea creatures, write about that. I've not written this poem yet, but I have this poem that I've been thinking about for years, of the time I took a kayak out into off Owen Beach and was surrounded by all these otters, and they just freaked me out. So, like, what is that for you? Is there a poem there? Another prompt is maybe look at the news and find a news story that speaks to you about the effects of humanity on the oceans, and turn that into a kind of poetic retelling. And what I mean by poetic retelling is to employ the toolbox, or the tools from the toolbox that we use as poets: imagery, language, figurative language, rhythm, rhyme, maybe, metaphor, maybe. What is it that takes that news story and makes it into a poem? Instead of just retelling the news story, give it more of a personal touch, right? Add some of those images in there that are going to make it uniquely yours. Third, think of a poem as a warning, like what Merwin and Jordan are doing in their work. How does your poem speak not only to the ocean, but to concerns of people, even if they aren't experts on the ocean or the environment, which I certainly am not, right? I don't know much about science. I envy the science people. I did not pay as close attention to those classes in school as I probably should have. So I'm always looking at the folks who do well in that work. Um, but write a poem that is just talking about what's to come, and that again doesn't have to necessarily be negative. You can be hopeful in that, right? What do you see trending towards the positive for the ocean and for us, and how we interact with it? And then, of course, as always, if you have a prompt, if you have an idea, run with it, whatever that is for you. One that I didn't put here would be, thinking more sort of surrealistically or imaginatively about, like, what if I was an ocean creature, what would that look like? And if you go back to April 23rd's workshop, which is on YouTube, the anthropomorphization workshop, where we were like writing animals in the voices, sort of like giving them human traits and letting them speak for themselves, you can combine that maybe with what we're working on here. Some resources, head to the Poetry Foundation, always head to the Poetry Foundation. They've got a nice article about ecopoetics, plus a bunch of essays about ecopoetics, plus a bunch of poems about ecopoetics. So if you really want to do a deep dive into this concept, you can do that on the Poetry Foundation's website. You can check out the full video of Merwin reading. It's like actually an hour-long reading, so you can hear him read a bunch of his work. If you want to get your hands on some books, Black Nature is where I got the June Jordan poem, 400 Years of African American Nature Poetry. It is available on Google Books. Actually, you can, I don't know if all of it's on there, but this poem was part of that. It's a great anthology that divides poems up into a bunch of different kind of themes and runs the gamut from the 1600s to the present day. The Ecopoetic Anthology is pretty much what it sounds like, an anthology of eco poems. And here, Poems for the Planet is a more recent Ecopoetics anthology that comes out of Copper Canyon, which is local in Port Townsend, and features a lot of Pacific Northwest poets as well. If you want to get some feedback on your draft, send it to info@write253.com. We'll give you some notes before you submit it. To remind you, the submission deadline is June the 1st, and you can go to tacomaoceanfest.org for all the submission information. Everyone who submits get a free Pete's coupon, so that's reason enough to send something in. And if you win, there's prizes. You get to read your stuff at Tacoma Ocean Fest, which is a cool event taking place September 13th down at the Foss Waterway. Learn more about Write253, Instagram, Write.253, Twitter, Write253. We're on the Facebook. We have a website. Come check us out. We've got a bunch of poetry writing workshops on our website that you can access for free. So if you got some time, you want to write some poems, some of them are super complicated forms like sestinas and American sonnets, and some of them are just like a list of line starters. But you can get your pen moving at our website. If you want to learn more about Tacoma Ocean Fest, hit up Tacoma Ocean Fest on Instagram and Twitter at Tacoma Ocean Fest. They are also on the Facebook. Thank you all for tuning in today. I hope you are going to enjoy the rest of this day and this weekend, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks for coming by.